Great. Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. A sincere thank you to you all, because I know you have a lot of choices about a lot of places to be and a lot of conversations to be part of, and I'm so glad and so thankful you've chosen to be part of this one, and look forward to obviously talking to you and talking to us a little later on. So we chose a title which in itself is a contradiction. Social media is dead, long live the social web, and I think I can speak for everybody who kind of is sitting on those fault lines between technology and media, where the essential skill of this age is to hold two contradictory thoughts in your brain as true without going insane. And so the first is, it's never been a worse time for the news business to be engaging with platforms. If you're not profoundly pessimistic about that relationship, then you're not paying attention. And yet, it has never been easier for all of us as individual journalists and sense makers to connect with the individuals that form our communities. And I think some trends accelerate that potential. If you don't believe in that, you have no imagination. So again, that contradiction. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the demise of what we kind of have come to know, at least my generation, and I realize now we're a couple of generations away from the birth of social media, as Facebook and Twitter, the death spiral of the X machine, and then move on to talk a little bit about the new trends. Things like, not platforms, but protocols that might open up a federated, decentralized web, and also I think the example of people who are making connections at scale on platforms that already exist. We'll talk about that. And we have a panel with unrivaled experience and insights, I have to say. Maybe I'll take it over here. Johanna, you are the social media strategist for the culture and documentary sections for Deutsche Welle, the German broadcaster, but you're also, in your own right, someone who has amassed hundreds of thousands of followers on TikTok and Instagram for your views, for your news from Germany. Right beside you is a good old mate of mine, Joanna Geary is now content and audience head for Bloomberg, but has been someone inside Twitter. Maybe a lot of people know this, has been an inspiring leader for those of us inside Twitter that believed in the cause of journalism, and she led the curation team there. She was there the day that the sync was brought in by Elon Musk. Before that, she was someone who built communities and audiences through social media for the Times of London and for The Guardian. We'll talk a little bit about that, and I think there's some people in the audience who might remember that era. Beside me on my right is Zoe Schiffer, is the managing editor of Platformer. If you're not reading Platformer, to inform you about that clash between Silicon Valley, big tech, society, democracy, then just go do it and subscribe. Former senior reporter at The Verge, and is also the author of the definitive book about the takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk, called Extremely Hardcore, at every good bookshop and every good audiobook platform. You're all very welcome. My name is Mark Little. I was a plush life of being an international news anchor. At one stage, and Twitter ruined my life, persuaded me to leave journalism, go in, form a social news agency called Storyful. I then went on to work for Twitter as the head of news partnerships in Europe, like a kid going to the candy shop with the keys, but didn't turn out the way I thought it might. So that's my reason for being the moderator. I'm going to start by going through the stories of how we, all four of us, have engaged. Maybe Joanna, can I start with you first of all? When you were starting way back when, that's a terrible thing to say, you were laughed at. I mean, there was scorn from editors when you said to them, we should be engaging on this new thing called Twitter, Facebook, social media in general. What was it like to be that kind of pioneer?
That's a nice question. So if I take you all back to the beginning of how I got embroiled in all of this, I was a regional news reporter, print reporter, and started to connect with people online through blogging, because that was the primary route to finding people and connecting. And so I started as someone who was tied to a desk and finding opportunity to build my community through connecting online. And it is fair to say that at the time that was seen as controversial, to the point where I got told I was reported to the union for blogging outside of work. Right. So there was a lot of reticence around the idea that you would expend any amount of your time connecting with people as a journalist through the medium that you also produced for your employer. You know, how dare you spend some time writing and other people read it when it's not being printed in your newspaper every day. So it really was a completely different world. And I think I think as I look back, I have a lot to look back on. It's been 84 years. It feels like lifetimes since then. I think one of the things I try and remember is just how much things have changed, also for the positive as well. Like there's certain things that we're able to do now as journalists, and I'm now back in the news industry, that I just couldn't do, and I was so frustrated that I couldn't do back then.
And I think that's a really good way of, Johanna, introducing your work, because step forward those, 10 or 12 years, you're building a massive audience on your own by direct connection to hundreds of thousands of people. What's the secret sauce today? Has it changed, do you think, as you listen to Johanna?
Yeah, so I started out in 2020. So about 4 years ago, I started Deutsche Welle's very first TikTok account called Berlin Fresh. And at that time, there weren't many media houses on TikTok, so I didn't really have a lot of best practice examples to look at, but I really wanted to learn how to reach young audiences on this new platform of journalistic content. And so I thought, okay, I'll just have to start my own personal account and just try out as many things in different formats as possible, and then whatever works, I can implement at my job. And so I ended up building a huge digital community by just really listening closely to my audience. And now it's funny because it actually works as a real-life community as well, and I do a meetups with my followers in Berlin, which is kind of nerve-wracking still every single time, because I'll put out a video and I'll say, you know, this Sunday, 3 o'clock, you can all meet me here, I'm gonna be in that spot. And then sometimes you see 100,000 people watching the video and you think, oh my God, how many people are gonna show up? But it's always the best experience and so much fun. And in my last meetup, my community, some people told me because they're international students in Germany, they couldn't go home for the holidays, so they all spent Christmas together celebrating. And so it's a community that really works well in real life, and that's kind of amazing, yeah.
Wow, we should try out this real life thing. It's amazing. Zoe, I'm your role at the moment. I noticed the fact that, you know, as a senior reporter for Verge, you worked for a website. You were kind of part of a business. Now you're an entrepreneur, building a business with Casey Newton, which is essentially all about community. How much of your day, for example, do you think about how do we engage and connect with the audience?
I mean, that's really our whole thing now. Now it's the business model. We work for our subscribers and our readers. And it's interesting because I came up during the traffic era of journalism, and we can talk a little bit later about why that business model was so problematic. But in that age, we were really focused on virality and scale and reaching as many people as quickly as possible and funding the journalism through that. Now I think we're making a switch, you know, me personally, but also as an industry, where we're much more focused on developing an audience and having more of a direct relationship with readers. And I think that there are challenges to that, but it's also incredibly rewarding because our incentive structure is aligned with the product. And that's not exactly true when you're selling ads to fund the journalism.
And you're not afraid to take hard decisions to maintain some integrity about that relationship. And you left Substack, which has now become the Nazi bar row in retrospect. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, so this is another interesting point. I mean, we have to think deeply about, you know, making, I guess, moral decisions, because we are a small business. My partner, Casey Newton, and I left Twitter right after Elon Musk started kind of directly harassing some of his own employees and kind of going after the mainstream press very aggressively. And then more recently, we switched from Substack to Ghost. And that decision in particular was one that we thought really deeply about. Do we want a platform like Substack to be moderating the content on it, or do we think of it more like internet infrastructure? But ultimately, it was our readers that started saying they were going to cancel subscriptions if we stayed on Substack. And now that's our boss. We work for them. And so when the readers have a strong viewpoint about what we should be doing, we do have to be somewhat reactive to that. And at the same time, what we said, you know, when we made that decision is we don't want to be in the position of constantly having a morality test for every platform that we're on, because at a certain point, all of these platforms have their own problems, and we have to kind of make trade-offs. But where we are now on a decentralized platform called Ghost, that's a nonprofit, it feels a little bit safer than a platform like Substack that is VC funded and focused on becoming more of a social network with requirements for content moderation that go with it.
I have to say, in some ways, that like very rational and thoughtful way you approach it was kind of very different to when we all first got involved, I think, in Twitter, where we were carried away to an extent, Joanne, I suppose, by, you know, I remember Clay Shirky had that great theory about here comes everybody democracy, Arab Spring, Tahrir Square, we were all taken away by the ultimate success of all this. You were in that part of the story. Take us forward when the sink walks in the door in Twitter. I mean, it must be heartbreaking to think about those two bookends of what I think is the first part of our panel here, social media being dead.
Yeah, I mean, so I walked into Twitter a week after the IPO in 2013 and didn't get a chance to walk out of Twitter because the decision was made very much for me, and I'm not sure it did sink in. I'm still working through that. I think there are a lot of lessons I'm still trying to figure out and take away from the experience of that. So just so you understand, by the time I left Twitter, I had a team of 150 people across the world who were focused on predominantly trying to bridge the gap where Twitter's algorithms weren't doing a good job around context, misinformation, around helping people to navigate on the platform. And we were doing that in a way that helped to actually ultimately benefit the algorithmic efforts as well. So we were talking about human in the loop. And we were so excited about the next phase of that, and it was all cut in an instant. None of that work really exists today, very, very little of it. Most of the teams involved in it were removed, whether that was my team or teams on the trust and safety side or on the partnership side. So that was a very hard pill to swallow because I had framed my ideology or my world around these are incredibly powerful platforms. They absolutely allow for the best and the worst of us all to be represented. I want to work to elevate the best and hope that the worst starts to sink. That was how I was thinking. And then someone just cut that off and said, that is a woke mind virus, goodbye. And it made me realize how little we can often control the future if we are not building the businesses that we want to build. If we are not taking the time to understand the business landscape, to understand how journalism is funded and take those risks ourselves. If we are going to mediate our work through someone else, whether that's Jack Dorsey's dream or Elon Musk's dream, we have to be prepared that they're going to not care. And I think that was like ultimately where I am at the moment, which is like super cheerful, I know.
No, but I think your point there about we have to have some control of the business, and I think to some extent, Zoe, there was a kind of a big lie, wasn't there? I mean, I think it's expressed by the mullet strategy, which BuzzFeed just talked about. Like, it's like business up the front, party down the back. We were constantly like thinking seriously about our work, and yet ultimately this was the era of traffic.
Yeah, I think that the kind of traffic era of journalism was based on this fundamental lie. It was this idea that we could take money from venture capital, platforms would funnel enormous amounts of traffic our way, and we would fund our foreign bureaus with the "what time is the Super Bowl" post. And we would do a lot of those types of posts, and they would do really, really well on the platform. But ultimately, that idea hinges on the platforms themselves having a real attachment to journalism and wanting us to succeed. And the reality is that that was never going to last. And we focused so much on traffic and so little on audience and developing loyalty from our readers. And I think that when the platforms decided they'd had enough and they were moving away from news, the floor kind of fell out from under us. And I think we're in a really different era now. If you look at the businesses that are succeeding, it's places like Bloomberg that has the terminal, or the New York Times that has bundling with games. It's not the places that were focused on scale in that way. And I think we have kind of a gap now where all of the middle, the Vices, the BuzzFeeds, have kind of gone away or changed very fundamentally. We have the really small creators like myself, the people who are on Substack and kind of building a direct relationship with the audience, or we have, the really big players. And I think we have yet to see what's going to come in that middle tier of really high caliber journalism that's done at somewhat of a smaller scale than the New York Times.
I think what's interesting, if I look at, Johanna, your example, why didn't you build on what I think we can all agree are kind of these declining platforms, at least in relation to news, like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, and chose TikTok and Instagram?
Yeah, I actually don't think social media is dead at all, because we know that a majority of young people get their news from TikTok and Instagram and these social platforms. So for us as journalists or media houses, I think it's obvious that we have to be on these platforms of our journalism, because that's where the audience is at. And I actually think this Gen Z news avoidance we always talk about is a myth, because I see with my own videos, the more newsy and informative the videos are, the higher the chance of them to go viral on TikTok or Instagram. And I think it's just that, you know, yes, young people want news, but they want them told differently than their parents. Obviously on the platforms they're already on, so TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, but also a different kind of storytelling in a more informal tone of voice, and you really have to break down the news and explain what it means for their daily lives. And that seems quite hard to do for many media houses, which is why, you know, the Reuters news report last year showed that the majority of young people actually who are on TikTok and Instagram don't get their news from us journalists or media houses. They get them from what we call social media personalities or news influencers. So, yeah.
So why do you think that next generation, sorry, Zoe, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I feel like the work that you're doing is so incredible, and it's hard to recreate, at least in the United States, because you do have this model where you're able to create content for those platforms, and you don't have to think, correct me if I'm wrong, as much about how do I get people off TikTok and to my journalism product. And I feel like that's where we get caught a little bit, because while we could learn so much from you and try and recreate your expertise on the platform, ultimately for us, we're not getting paid unless we get people to subscribe or read the articles. And if we don't have public funding, I think that it's really difficult to understand how that could become a viable business.
Why do you think the next generation of news consumers are moving away from places like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube? Well, they're still on YouTube in great droves, but why are they going to places like Instagram? What's different about places like that?
Yeah, I think it's all about short-form video content and short-form video storytelling. And of course, for us as journalists, we're always worried about getting too dependent on one platform. I mean, we're seeing it just now with Twitter. And so, but I always say, you know, we are not dependent on one app. We're not dependent on TikTok. We learn as journalists the short-form video storytelling, and that's going to stay. That's not going away. And once we've learned that and mastered that, you know, at Deutsche Welle, we shoot TikTok first, but a TikTok is also an Instagram Reel, is also Facebook Reel, is also a YouTube Short. So it's just important to learn this type of storytelling. And then, for instance, TikTok is already banned in India, but we at Deutsche Welle have a great success on posting our short-form video content on an app called Josh, which is kind of the TikTok clone. So no matter what the app called or if it goes away, as long as we learn how to connect with these young audiences and to tell our news in the way they want to listen to it, then, you know, we're going to be successful.
Can I just, go ahead, Joanna.
No, it's okay.
No, go ahead.
Well, so I'm taking on the role as the old woman on the panel. I think it like in many ways, like what you're suggesting and kind of the same thing. Like ultimately, we have to make the decisions that make sense from the model that we're working from in how we reach out to our community. And I've heard over the last couple of days a lot of articulation of the platforms, the goddamn platforms, and everything that happened. And I do understand that. Like, there was a lot of ways that the platforms enticed people to do certain types of journalism in certain ways because that was of interest to their business model. And guess what? People try and encourage people to adopt something that benefits their business model. Journalism knows its business models, it knows its problems, and it knows its audiences, and it knows that it has to connect with the audiences. I want to take you guys back to The Guardian in 2011 when I joined, and they knew about community. They had a community team. They had a pioneer of online community work called Meg Pickard. But by the time I arrived, things were already starting to change. So it was clear that when working with the newsrooms, despite my background in community engagement, the word engagement had been devalued to the point of just looking at stuff. Ah, we have an engaged user. They looked at a page. that is an engaged user. Like, we stopped caring about our relationships with our audiences. And so I think, like, and you know, I hold myself accountable there. It was, I didn't scream and shout about that as much as I could, because I frickin' loved online news gathering, because it was fast and exciting and easy and fun. And it was something I could focus on. But it wasn't ever going to contribute to the business model. So if really we wanted to focus on the business model, we should have focused on the harder stuff.
But here's the contradiction right now, and I don't want to dwell on X for a length of time, but just we do need to revisit, I think, a little bit, because it wasn't just the platforms giving us a supply of engagement and people to engage with. There was a demand from us as journalists to be on a platform that was the real-time newswire. I'll never forget the first time I saw an astronaut biting an apple in space, and I'm like, holy shit. So in that regard, why isn't Twitter just more than a shit show, to use the technical term? Why is it not dead now? I mean, it has a remarkable resilience for a lot of journalists, right? I mean, can I ask maybe a question of everybody? Who here in the audience has stopped being a regular user of Twitter and gone to an alternative recently?
That's 2 questions.
Oh. Yeah. Who's still actively on Twitter? On X, sorry. Okay, interesting. Maybe that's something it is still very relevant. I mean, Zoe, it's still people there? Why are they there?
I think because we were taught our whole careers that we had to be, like, how much time did we all as journalists spend developing an audience there? And walking away from that, I think, is really scary. I think I, like many of you, have a way bigger audience on X than I do on any other platform, and yet I've made the decision to leave. And the reason for that is, why would you invest in a closed platform that is owned by someone who has said very directly that one of their core objectives is fighting and dismantling the mainstream press or the journalism industry? I think, at least with decentralization, we have the promise that if we have to leave, if Mark Zuckerberg does something truly reprehensible, or if he continues to downgrade news, we can take our audience with us. And I think continuing to invest in a platform where the platform itself owns our audience, it owns all of our content, all of our followers, and all of the people we follow, is it's a mistake. And I think, honestly, if we really believed in our work and we had confidence in what we were doing, we wouldn't feel the need to still be there, at least for journalists. I know that there are other communities, finance, crypto, et cetera, sports Twitter, that have been hard to recreate elsewhere, but I don't personally think that that's true for our industry.
Again, I feel that contradictory emotion when I go on, Joanna, see like the way in which, for example, the war in Gaza is being covered on X, the toxic wave coming at you, and yet the tug is to stay around to see what happens next. I mean, what do you think?
Everyone loves a very slow car crash, right? Like, it's, I mean, I have a lot of empathy for what Zoe was talking about around, like, as an industry, we have to make sure that we are not being taken advantage of by the way that platforms operate. But I also know that as journalists, we also need to be where our communities are and where our people are. And I know that there is a lot of Schadenfreude, thank you, going on about X or Twitter right now within the journalism community. But there's still, people are still going to use a product if it gets them to enables them to do something that they can't do elsewhere. And as much as the promise of decentralization is there, there is still something about being able to get your message out globally at scale in real time that there really isn't an alternative to right now. And I think when you have communities that require that, or organizations that require that, I think they're still going to be using Twitter for as long as it can limp along, and you know, and over time maybe actually grow again, depending on what Elon chooses to do with it next.
Can I go back to you, Johanna, because I'm so awed and inspired by the way in which you've described the connections you now have, and I'm actually looking in the audience. I see Sophia Smith-Gaylor there, who is a remarkable presence, I think, and an inspiration to many of us who've seen people making connections. I think today, earlier on, we had Motaz Zaya, who's come from Gaza. He has 18 million Instagram followers amassed over the past 6 to 7 months and reporting in the most visceral way. And I've been a foreign correspondent. I've never seen anything like it. So I'm so inspired by what your example and the example I've quoted there, but I'm also a little worried because it is being built on another platform, which in all response, TikTok is no better, no worse, possibly than Twitter was or is. Same, I suppose, with Instagram owned by Facebook. So are you not worried that this connection you're making is built on very shaky ground?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can never be dependent on one app and one platform, and you have to diversify. And especially with TikTok, there is a lot of censorship going on. I mean, I recently had the case because in Germany, cannabis just got legalized. And so my young audience was very interested in the legalization and had lots of questions and wanted me to do lots of videos on it, but I cannot say the word cannabis or marijuana or weed or any of the other words on TikTok, because then I get slapped with a community guideline violation and the video worst case gets taken down. And so I had to develop all these workarounds, I would say, a certain plan. And I used to just like use like the hemp picture and point at it and not say it, but just point at it. But the last time I did that, actually the video went viral really fast, and then at 800,000 views, it suddenly stopped, and I got a community guideline violation because, of course, the artificial intelligence picked up on the picture. So then afterwards, I didn't even use the picture anymore and just kept saying, a certain plant. And it's funny because the community, of course, gets it. They know why I can't say it, and they also respect it and don't even say the word in the comments because they are already so smart they know it gets picked up if they even comment on that. So, I mean, as a journalist, of course, it doesn't feel great to have to work around these censorship issues. And yeah.
And I think what we all know is those decisions are so opaque. I mean, there's no real transparency around them. Zoe, I'm struck by something that maybe 2022 with the Sync incident in Elon marks the end of an era. But there's a significance about 2019 when Mike Masnick publishes a paper called Protocols, Not Platforms. And it is, I think people look back on that now and will say he proposed essentially that we will reduce our dependence on platforms by having a more decentralized open web, maybe resembling what we all wanted it to be in the beginning. Can you talk us through how that influential paper has become something of a reality?
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I think it's really hard for us to conceptualize like what this would even look like. Like the value prop is actually so big for all of us, but it's such a change from what we've known in these closed platform systems that the metaphor that we often use is that social media would function more like email. And if this is really rudimentary, I apologize, but just to explain it really clearly, the idea is that you could sign up for an email provider and talk seamlessly with someone. If you have Gmail who has Yahoo, you wouldn't understand that they're using a different provider because the underlying protocols are interconnected. And when you leave the platform itself, you take with you your content, everything that you've posted about, and your lists, the people you follow and the people who follow you, so you can recreate it and you're not starting from the ground up. Now, we're at this point where Meta and Blue Sky have kind of promised a lot of this stuff, and they haven't fully delivered, but it looks like they are actually going to. And I think that, to Johanna's point, like there's a loss in this because we don't have one kind of global platform. And yet, I think I still have this open question of if that loss is not, like, if it's not outweighed by the benefit that we are getting by having a more personalized experience and a platform that we can actually trust will be ours, regardless of what the kind of tech company does. And so while I think we still have yet to kind of make that switch cognitively on like what this new world would look like, I think the possibility is actually quite exciting.
Because it does, I think, if, for example, Threads, which I find very frustrating because it's like the latest news event is 2 days old.
Yeah.
But I suppose in this scenario, someone could come in, build a list system,
Yes.
Improve the sort of frequency and the speed of that kind of thread.
This is the kind of other thing about decentralization. It's not just that like you can use Threads and post just on Threads, but it'll go to Blue Sky and Mastodon automatically. It's also that the APIs will be open. And so rather than asking Threads to solve kind of our business model problem in the news industry, we could have news companies that are building on Threads apps and kind of creating, if you want an algorithm that is much more newsy and much more like the old Twitter used to be, you could actually do that by by using something that was built by a publisher, not by Threads itself. And again, like they haven't opened up the API yet. They have said they're going to, and so I think we're at the point where it's like the promise is there and we need to hold them to it. But that's why I feel a little bit, not suspicious, but like hesitant when people say like, oh my God, Threads isn't leaning into news. Of course we want them to walk back that stance. And at the same time, I think the promise of Threads is that they wouldn't have to. We don't have to have Meta fix the news crisis. We could actually do that ourselves by making them stick to the promise of decentralization.
Joanna, one of the things I was excited about working at Twitter was this kind of was working in a kind of an informal reality where Twitter was actually countless small niche communities that were authentic, integral, and I mean, think about where, you know, Black Lives Matter came from. It came organically out of the communities there. So do you think it's all good news that we'd have this kind of move to this more open, decentralized reality?
So I think I'm still working out completely what I think about this, but I think we're seeing this decentralized conversation through the lens of Twitter being acquired by Elon. And I really want to paint the fact that this could have been a different reality. Now, I am still piecing together the timeline of this, but in 2019, I was at the leadership summit for Twitter, Jack, and the 150 top leaders at the company. It was exactly as you would imagine. There was a lot of meditation.
Saltwater juice was not used.
There was that, and also I was pregnant and very sleepy, so I had to get colleagues to elbow me and wake me up in the middle of the meditations because I'd start to snore. Anyway, this was early 2019, and it was when my first recollection of Jack proposing a decentralized Twitter. And he was very honest at the time. He said, I think the mistake we made was to make this a centralized process. I believe that there are 3 or 4 Twitters. There's Twitter, the data company, there's Twitter, the media company, and there's Twitter, the protocol. And there are both technical reasons why it would make sense for us to decentralize and also ethical ones. And that was the large conversation at this 2019 summit. And I remember going up to Parag, who then became the CEO, and I was like, how do we feel about decentralizing one of the key elements of shareholder value while our shareholders still own us? And he was like, no, it's fine, because it will make things more efficient, so we will be able to do it. We didn't do it. We didn't do it for a lot of reasons. I'm not in engineering, and I cannot speak to that. It was an ongoing project. Blue Sky was a way to sort of try and accelerate that. And there is a reality, an alternate reality out there somewhere where we did it, and Twitter became decentralized. And did that, would we even be talking about fragmented organizations at this point? Because it largely served those many communities that you mentioned were on it, and it was doing kind of a good job. Maybe we are quick to think we need these little isolated spaces for this to work.
Well, in some ways, isn't it that platforms and the people designing them are catching up with the reality that you see, Johanna, which is that people who cater to a specific niche community, not try and impress their 2 billion closest friends, are the ones who are really connecting in the deepest possible way. I mean, I think that seems to me the lesson from what you're doing and so many people like you who are at scale, but also at real deep engagement.
Yeah, you really do have to stick to your niche on TikTok and Instagram. And for me, for example, my niche is I bring news updates from Germany, about Germany, and every time I try to do something different, like because I run my accounts in my free time, I don't have a lot of time to film content. So sometimes when I'm traveling, I'm like, oh, I'm in Rome. I want to do 3 things you can do in Rome. But these videos never work because nobody wants to see me having fun in Rome because it's not that kind of account, Then people actually comment, but when are you going back to Germany and where are my news updates from Germany? And I'm like, calm down, I'm here for a weekend, I'm coming back. And so you really have to have your niche and you have to stick to it, and your audience expects certain topics from you, and they don't want to see something else, and they really tell you what they want.
Can I come back to something I think someone said earlier on about it, the need for us as journalists to be building our own businesses with the engagement that we are delivering? I mean, is there a danger that because of this, the importance of that niche appeal, that we start to fragment ourselves so much that it's harder to build a business model or easier? I'm just a little bit confused about that. I mean, for example, you cannot derive income from your 300,000 followers on Instagram. I mean, is there a danger that we end up back in a situation where journalism is just not cracked the business model?
Well, the reason why I can't monetize because I can't do brand deals as a journalist at a public broadcaster. So that's kind of my internal rule. So, but in theory, you know, as journalists, of course, you could monetize, you could do brand deals. Although I personally feel that's very hard for us journalists to do, because how are you going to advertise something and then not lose the trust of your audience? But weirdly enough, my community always thinks I make money off of my content, and they always feel very sorry for me when they find out I don't, and they want to give me tips in the comments. They're like, oh, you're not making money, but try this, or try this brand deal, or do this. And they don't even understand the problem that I have, that I'm a journalist, I can't advertise for anything, because I think these young audiences, they perfectly understand that you're creating content for them, but you also have to make a living off of it. And so they are much more liberal, I guess, than we as journalists are.
Just before we go to questions, I do want to ask, my sense will be that we will have, you know, like you talk about platformers being in a very clear niche, very clear appeal. Are we going to see now the development, the acceleration of a trend toward all of us having the capacity to be independent, to connect with our communities, but the rapid descent of the news business as it currently is?
I mean, I think that descent has been happening regardless. Like, I think we've had a real problem with the business model of journalism, and this model of independent creators is coming up and filling somewhat of a void. I don't think it's going to be for everyone. Like, I think we will have other journalism businesses that kind of fill the space that BuzzFeed and Vice had, and producing that kind of great journalism. But I do think it's a really good option. And just to speak to the fragmentation, you know, we had this big fear, especially, you know, moving from Vox or The Verge to Substack, and then deciding to leave Twitter, which was like our main distribution avenue. How are we going to get the stories out? And how will people convert from like seeing a free story and actually becoming a paid subscriber and paying us to produce the journalism that we do? But we've seen, honestly, zero drop off after making that switch. It took a couple months, but now posting those stories on Blue Sky, Mastodon, and Threads, which again are smaller platforms, we've seen a conversion rate that's at least steady, and if not growing a little bit. And so I think ultimately, like, I don't know if this sounds naive or idealistic, but like producing a great product is always going to pay off. And I think when we focus too much on like, how can we kind of game the system a little bit, or how can we like perfect this new form of storytelling? While I think that that's a really good idea, it always comes back to like the quality of the stories that we are producing. And if we produce really good work, I think ultimately people will pay us for it.
I can tell you that one really good way to get someone to pay for your journalism is to do an excellent job reporting on the absolute dumpster fire of their company as it gets bought by a billionaire. And I am a fully paid up member and subscriber of Platformer for exactly that. And while that, you know, I sound like I'm making light of it, what I think Casey and Zoe did was they understood their audience. They knew who they were writing to and for and about, and they targeted it so well and their coverage so well that like the audience, there was no choice but to sign up and to subscribe. You were our insight, actually.
And you proved that the age of the scoop is not over. I think it's the other thing.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah. They were like the extra member in Signal having a gossip with us. It was incredible.
Great, and thank you. We're going to take our first question. Did you have a hand up? That was great. I didn't even say it. We already have our first. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sandra. I'm from Finland, public broadcasting. I'm wondering how, when you're on TikTok or Instagram, how do you communicate to your audience that your content is reliable and adheres to certain journalistic standards as opposed to, say, a non-journalistic influencer, or does it even matter for the audience?
Oh, good question. Yeah. So for me, I think the majority don't know, I work for Deutsche Welle in Germany's international broadcast. They just see me as Johanna, and I think I stick to the journalistic standards I would do at my day job as well. So I never have an opinion. I always give the facts. I have more than one source, and represent both sides. And I think they just first they're surprised because they're not used to TikTok and Instagram is very opinionated content, and you can go much more easily viral with opinions. And so first I think it's surprising for them, but then they learn, oh, Johanna, she never gives her opinion, she's always neutral, and this is how you build trust over time. And these are actually the most comments I get why people follow me, is because they say, oh, you don't give your opinion, you're neutral, I can trust you. And they see like how fast I am, how consistent I am, how I explain, and that I actually read a draft law, because I'll show them, I'll be like, here's the 100 pages draft law, these are the important parts for you, and this is what it means for your life. So they know I've gone to the source, I've looked for what's important for their lives. And I mean, I know I cannot report on a new law if I can't explain what it means for your daily life. And so yeah, I really have to stick to that. And I think this is how you build trust.
That's great. And I would just add to that, there's this recent report by the Financial Times Strategy Group called Next Generation News, how younger people establish trust through affinity, transparency. It's really worth a read. I think it's backed up everything that you've just said, but something we all should, I think, read deeply. The second question is right there.
Kate Morgan, IT consultant from Malta, and I have a question for all of you. I want to hear opinion about future trends on tools to use for reaching community. So you talk about Instagram, Threads, Twitter, but for next year, in your opinion, what tools you're going to use to reach your community?
Any new tools that we're not overwhelmed with already?
Or maybe existing tools.
Right. Yeah, investing more in something.
In terms of the social platforms?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I am investing the most in Threads, which I feel, some type of way about, but I do think, again, like going back to the promise of decentralization, I feel like somewhat confident that although, making a moral decision to get off X and then like investing heavily in Meta is like not the clearest moral choice, at least then I can feel confident that like it's an investment that I can take with me elsewhere. And I think also like Threads is still at the point where I think a lot of social platforms go through this evolution where you can kind of get a big following right at the beginning pretty easily by having your kind of niche and being consistent, and then it gets much, much harder over time, like y'all have seen. And so I think we're still at that point where it's like, it's a good time to do it and be on it. And I am trying to get better at TikTok, so maybe Johanna will give me tips after this.
More questions? Any more questions? Sorry, we have the microphone, and there you go.
Hi, my name is Freddie. I'm from a platform on the social web called Newsmast. We were created specifically to facilitate interesting conversations by journalists, media organizations, academics and things like that. So we're really interested in supporting the onboarding of all of you onto the social web. Basically, we're developing tools that will make that easier. And I guess my question is, since we can't wave a magic wand and just magic another 200 million users out of thin air, how do we convince media outlets to be first movers into decentralized platforms, maybe aside from Threads, which, as Zoe mentioned, has some obvious downsides being associated with Meta?
Joanna, can I ask you, given that you have cajoled enough news editors into doing something on social in your lifetime, what would you say?
Oh, I'd say, what else are you there for? And who else are you there for? Because I think actually my biggest advice to journalists is like, you don't go places where you're talking to other journalists. And one of the things about a lot of journalists removing themselves from Twitter is I think that's generally a good thing, because maybe they weren't actually talking to their audiences in the first place. They were just talking to other journalists. And so if you are a platform and you're like, what I really want is journalists to be on my platform, I think you have to ask yourself, why? What job are you trying to get done for a wider audience than journalism? Because I think if you're creating it just for journalists, you're creating another echo chamber, and I think that's exactly what we want to try and avoid.
Could I also say encourage everybody to encourage startups in media. Don't have enough of them. And to the gentleman who just asked the question, I hope to come back in 5 years and see your 200 million users 100%. Of your, so please, yeah, more startups. We have one more question here in the front row.
Thanks. Yep, right here. So I pay your salary. That's the business model. My taxes in Germany pay Johanna to tell me German news that I don't get in English in any other form. So thank you. First of all, that's something that every country could probably copy, including the other place where I pay taxes, the United States. So why doesn't public media, public broadcasters copy what she does? That's your business model. I'm your customer.
Yeah,
Isn't this another panel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a way bigger question than the journalism industry itself can solve. I think we're at a point right now where, like, NPR, they're talking about defunding it because of these kind of like content decisions that they've made or have been accused of making. Like, I just think it's gotten very contentious in the United States, and like that's the dream, and I would love it, but I think that it's not solely up to us to fix ultimately.
I think one more question we've time for. Anyone else? Yes, we just, Nick Newman down there in the orange, very fetching.
Nick Newman, Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'd like to hear your views about the future of the social web. Where will we be in 4 or 5 years' time? What's your, it's a chaotic time right now, but how's it going to settle down, or isn't it?
You go first.
I mean, I think that we are going to be in a space where it is more fragmented and we have many more smaller communities. And while I think that there is a drawback to that, like we said earlier, actually, I don't know what having a big global platform got us ultimately. Like, I think there was this period where it was like the promise of powering democracy, and a lot of my sources at Twitter, I think, really believed in that mission, and there was real beauty in that. It gave rise to many social movements that were incredibly important. But it also helped fuel this immense polarization that we've seen in the United States and elsewhere. And I think that's not solved by having smaller communities, but I think when we allow people to moderate content in a more niche way, it could provide certain things that we haven't had previously, and it'll create new problems. But I think ultimately that's kind of the direction for good and bad where we're headed.
I somewhat agree. I will also point out, not expecting a pity party here in the journalism festival, but running a platform is really hard. It's very complex, and I expect a lot of people to have a go. I expect some communities to adopt some platforms that are going to fold. I expect consolidation again. It may look or feel a bit different from Twitter, but there will be some elements that seem very similar, and then we will moan about that company, whoever is managing it, or that company might be X. I don't know. But I think we can't, nothing stays still.
I think for us journalists, it's going to be even more about communities and listening to your community and community building. And, any journalist who doesn't tell their audience in the first few seconds why this news is relevant for them, why they should stick around, why they should watch it, why it matters for their lives, I think they're going to die out. And if you're not sparking dialogues and listening to the people, I think you're really going to be losing out.
Well, we've run out of time, but one final quick question, a quick fire one. I think we haven't even touched upon the impact of AI. I saw Casey Newton yesterday writing about the rise of synthetic social networks. With this wave of AI-generated crap, how do great storytellers, great journalists stand out? What's the first bit of advice you'd give them?
Oh gosh, I mean, we went to a panel this morning, I don't know if y'all were there, on kind of the future of journalism in the era of AI, and a lot of what they talked about was, the fear that journalists become unpaid workers because our content is being used to train these models. And I had a question, and we didn't have time to answer it, but it was like, is it really just a question of price? If these companies will pay us enough in order to have our content in the training data, is that going to ultimately solve our problem? Or are we then just putting ourselves in a position yet again where we're asking tech companies to fix the failing business model of the journalism industry? And I think that there's a real fear of that. I think the idea that generative AI will be able to create content that competes with great journalism, I haven't seen that yet. I think it can be a really interesting tool, particularly for coding and other things like that, with data journalism in particular. But in terms of competing with large-scale investigations, I mean, time will tell, but right now we're simply not there.
What do journalists need to do to stand out?
In general, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, basically, you really have to go back and explain and break it down for your audience. And I think a lot of the AI-based discussions is a very fear-based discussion, which reminds me of, when online was taking over print journalism, or when social media was taking over online journalism, and that never got us anywhere. To close our eyes and pretend it's not happening, that never got us anywhere, and that won't get us anywhere in this discussion either.
Great. We're just being told it is time. I want to say thank you to our panel. I want to say thank you to all of you as well. Thank you. So just to finish off.